Thank you for joining a BRYCS webinar today on unaccompanied children, a study on integration. This webinar will be an hour long. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you need help troubleshooting during this presentation, please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen or email us at info@brycs.org. We will be recording and archiving this presentation, and anybody who has registered will be sent that recording, a copy of the slides, as well as an evaluation. You'll also be redirected to that evaluation at the close of today's presentation. We will hold questions until a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, and then when we do that Q&A session, please use the chat box again on the right-hand side of your screen to submit any of your questions. In the event that we do not get to your question, we will be sure to answer that on the comments section of the BRYCS blog. The link to the supplemental blog to this webinar is in the chat box currently. So without further ado, I will introduce our presenters to you today. We have Tiara Beach. Tiara is a licensed graduate social worker with a focus on child welfare in the international migration and cross-border context. She's passionate about developing and supporting culturally sensitive and trauma-informed programming for vulnerable children and youth, especially those who are unaccompanied in forced migration. Her experience focuses on child and family assessment and service planning, as well as program monitoring, consultation, and capacity development. She currently serves on the foster care team at Migration and Refugee Services here at USCCB. We also have Simi Cuervo, who is a licensed professional counselor in Washington, D.C. She is currently employed as a Children's Services Specialist with USCCB MRS in our Miami office. She has previously worked as a youth mental health therapist in D.C., and her areas of expertise include working with individuals suffering from depression, substance abuse, trauma, and adjustment issues. And finally, we have Jennifer Siegel. She is the Refugee Child Protection Coordinator here at USCCB, and she manages the resettlement of attached refugee children who are separated from their biological parents. Previously, she has served on the Familyfication team, working on programming for unaccompanied children. She has a master's in social work from Michigan State University. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you, ladies.
All right, thanks so much, Jackie. Just so you know, this voice is from Jenny Siegel. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Unaccompanied children who have been migrating from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to the United States for years were largely unnoticed by the general population until this phenomenon captured our nation's attention in the summer of 2014. That year, the number of unaccompanied children that showed up at the U.S.-Mexico border reached approximately 68,000, which was a 75% increase from the year before. Since then, the number of UCs apprehended at the border has decreased. However, the flow of migration of these children escaping targeted and generalized gang violence, domestic abuse, and economic disparity is steady and not showing signs of stopping anytime soon. Their presence in the U.S. sparked our curiosity about what it's like to be an unaccompanied youth integrating into a local community. From an empirical standpoint, little is known about what factors impact their successful integration. What was most important to us is that very little has been learned from the youth's perspective, and we believe that their voice matters most in this. While there is little research on this topic in general, there's even less that gleans information directly from the youth. Therefore, we conducted our research analysis highlighting the youth's perspective along with their caregivers and case managers to help gain a better understanding about what helps UC adjust and integrate. As programs are built for them, it's important to understand how they are impacted by programs and the world around them. We can use this information to help shape programs and policies that impact unaccompanied youth and hopefully have a greater impact. We hope the results of this study help inform your work and ours with unaccompanied children. So the objectives of our research, one of them was to identify factors that successfully support child integration and those that present important challenges. We also wanted to be able to provide recommendations to critical stakeholders and recommendations for program development, planning, policy, and practice. And also we're hoping to build a framework for which future studies can be done to expand our analysis.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tiara. And I'll give you a little bit of background to our research. Prior to developing the interview tools for our study, we did some background research on similar studies that have been done looking at integration factors for similar populations of migrant or refugee youth, both in the U.S., in Europe, and Australia. And overall, the studies that we looked at highlighted the importance of both internal and external factors impacting migration. So some examples of internal factors might be things like a youth's own goals in their migration, their sense of personal agency or their ability to affect their future, their internal coping skills. And external factors might be things like supportive adults in the life of the youth, availability of community resources, social or educational institutions that the youth might access throughout their process of integration. And so this background research provided a framework for us as we were delving into factors that might be impacting unaccompanied children here in the U.S. As Jenny said, these studies also emphasize that the direct perspective of youth as well as their caregivers is essential to understanding what really impacts integration for these children. And like our study, most of these studies were qualitative samples of youth and caregivers, and so that also impacted the way we structured our study. And if you are wondering what we mean by the term integration, we focused primarily our attention on what factors helped youth to feel safe, welcomed, supported, and able to thrive in their communities in the U.S. And as we were looking at those factors, we obviously uncovered some barriers along the way, and so we'll address both types of findings today.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Simi. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the methodology that we used to conduct this research. We did both qualitative and quantitative research techniques to gather the data that we found. As a foundation for the research, we began with qualitative interviews of the youth, their caregivers, and their case managers. And the goal of the qualitative analysis was to gather the perspectives of the youth, the caregivers, and their case managers on what factors support a migrant child's successful integration and transition of life into the United States. We interviewed 9 youth along with their caregivers and case managers. Following the qualitative interview, USCCB staff gathered responses from written surveys from program management staff from both the Family Reunification and the Long-Term Foster Care Network to gather quantitative data for this integration, for the child integration into their local communities. 8 long-term foster care programs and 4 family reunification programs completed the surveys. Some limitations of our research is that our sample size is relatively small, particularly for the qualitative assessment. Second, the children who were chosen to participate were chosen based on recommendation and willingness to participate, and there wasn't an incentive given to encourage greater participation. So the generalizability of the study is limited in scope. However, as Jenny had said earlier, we're hoping that the study is intended to be foundational and will be an impetus for broader analysis of the topic. Some other limitations included logistical limitations with Adobe Connect, which is the software program that we use to conduct the interviews. Because of technology, we lost some interview data. There was also some difficulty in scheduling with foster care families due to their already very active schedules. And mostly all of the interviews with the children and with some of the caregivers were done in Spanish. So as you know, working with this, whenever you're working with translation, some things can get lost in translation, as they say, which we found that to be true for this study as well. So just some limitations there that we found. However, when we did look at the transcripts from the interviews and from the survey, we identified the following factors indicating toward successful integrations. These 6 categories were identified as being the most significant. And then we're going to break down these categories and themes even further into our presentation. We'll discuss both opportunities and challenges in each context, as well as some promising practices and some recommendations towards the end on working with unaccompanied children.
All right, so the following slides will focus on the factors towards successful integration. One significant finding and factor in fostering successful integration of unaccompanied children in their communities was the role that case managers played. In our interviews with both youth and caregivers, their responses overwhelmingly credited case managers in assisting them after they arrived to the U.S. and as they settled into life in the U.S. There were really 2 aspects of case management that were discussed, and we're calling these roles and characteristics and then their responsibilities that they played. One important characteristic or role of a case manager was their ability to be culturally sensitive and culturally competent. From our survey, all case managers we interviewed were Spanish-speaking. They all had prior experience of working with this population, or maybe they had some sort of similar cultural experience with this population or training. All of the organizations that we surveyed provided some sort of migration-related or cultural training to their case managers. And many of them emphasize the importance of establishing and building partnerships with service recipients in a common language, so that when they would make referrals for youth to go meet with a counselor, that referral, there was already an establishment there, and that counselor spoke Spanish. So speaking the same language was something that we heard quite often from the youth and from the caregivers, that they could communicate with their case managers in a language that was their own and that they felt comfortable with. And if the case manager did not speak Spanish, that an interpreter was provided. Also, having cultural insight. Case managers were found to have a good understanding of the youth and their journeys, and even things like the foods that they ate or the music that they liked. Those types of cultural competency components were found to be important with youth and caregivers. And case managers, they were cultural brokers, right? They helped bridge the divide or bridge the gap between 2 cultures and provided education for youth into the U.S. culture. The other aspect of case management that was important was accessibility. And accessibility really took two shapes. One was that they were sort of physically accessible either through phone or in person to be able to meet and talk about things. But the other one is that they were accessible because they were trustworthy and they were committed. And youth and caregivers over and over again emphasized that it was important that they felt like they could go to their case manager for things, that their case manager was accessible. And the other piece of sort of the role and characteristic that a case manager played was that they were not only for youth, but they were also for caregivers. And caregivers overwhelmingly responded to the importance that a case manager played in their lives in helping them be connected to resources and helping them deal with the newness of having their youth, of being reunited with their youth again. The other aspect of case management was their responsibilities, or the things that they provided and the services that they provided to the youth and their families. One was through empowerment. This was supporting the youth in self-determination and accomplishing their goals. Case managers often did this through encouragement, teaching youth to do things or teaching caregivers to do things like helping youth enroll in school, and also helping youth to be able to set goals. This empowerment aspect was mentioned quite a bit in the interviews with the youth and the ways that their case manager interacted and guided them. Youth often remarked about the importance of being encouraged by their case manager through the empowerment that they provided. The other aspect or responsibility of the case managers was the advocacy that they provided. From our survey, caseworkers often spent 15 to 20% of their time advocating on behalf of the youth and their caregivers, whether it be with the school district or with a mental health care provider or a medical provider. They spent that time advocating on behalf of the youth. This is significant because of the youth's state of vulnerability when they arrive, and sometimes the caregiver's lack of knowledge of the systems that are available or the systems that should be available to them. Caregiver or case managers often helped youth and caregivers understand what their rights were, especially important for a population of people that often is undocumented or in these instances were undocumented. They also acted as a resource broker. This was significant for case managers to not just hand over a list of resources to youth or to their caregivers, but provide them with a list of resources that the caseworkers and the agencies already had established partnerships with and established relationships with. And so, youth often remarked it wasn't just call this person and see if you can get signed up for counseling. It was call this person and giving a name and a phone number, and they know that you're going to be calling and they're expecting your call. And those sorts of things really went a long ways when it came to not only building that trust, but also helping that youth to be able to make that phone call or helping the caregiver to be able to make the phone call. The support that case managers provide to unaccompanied children and their family has a considerable impact on the lives of families and often guides the youth towards successful integration. I want to leave you with one quote that came out through the interviews that we had with a caregiver. And she said, the most important thing that a caseworker has done for my children is, well, everything. They recommended the doctors, the counselors, and attorneys. The caseworker has been there with us through this journey.
The second theme that emerged from our interviews was the community setting. And obviously, the community is an important context for the process of integration for youth because it's the environment in which youth are residing, where they're accessing services, where they're interacting with other peers or adults. And so when talking with them about the community, many youth and caregivers contrasted their feelings of safety in their current community with the dangers that they faced in their country of origin. And the population that we were speaking with for these interviews, as we well know, are youth who were fleeing generalized violence and the threat of gangs in Central America. And so the importance of safety in their new communities is not surprising to us based on the type of situation they were leaving. And youth talked about the importance of being able to walk freely down the street, the importance of being able to choose situations and scenarios that would not be dangerous to them. And this was highlighted in our interviews with youth and with caregivers about what they thought was important about their new communities. By contrast, we also heard some youth express concerns about discrimination in their new communities and experiencing discrimination as immigrants. One of the youth stated, "We should all have the same opportunities here. Some people do come to do bad things, but most of us aren't that way. We just want to have the same opportunities." And so we heard from youth that feeling free also from discrimination here in the U.S. is an important part of feeling settled in a new community where they're living. a second thing that's related to the community that was important was the ability to access medical and mental health service providers, especially. So youth and caregivers described these types of services, medical and mental health services, as crucial to the support that they received from programs that were helping them. For example, one sponsor said it's a huge blessing to have insurance for, she was talking about her daughters, because the insurance they have now will cover them until they turn 19 years old. So there's a way to take them to the hospital if they get sick. And my oldest daughter is with a psychiatrist. She's able to keep her appointments, and that is because the service provider that they were connected with was able to provide them with access to medical care. And we know that the majority of the programs that we surveyed, the foster care and family reunification programs, have established relationships with local medical and mental health providers in their area. And they especially seek out providers who speak a common language, as Jenny was saying, with the families and youth so that there's a seamless transition in terms of accessing services there. But we also heard that when youth or families reside farther away from these programs or in more rural areas where the program has not been able yet to establish regular partnerships, there are new challenges that arise, especially with youth being able to access public transportation and a means to get to service providers that they need, and also in more rural settings or in areas where the program doesn't have established relationships, it's much harder for them to find programs who are willing to work with a new population or programs that have the language competency to serve this population. In regards to recreational and extracurricular activities, we heard that that many youth express that participating in art or sports or other types of outlets really help them to begin to create new relationships and friendships, to feel more connected to their community, and also to release energy and tension. As we know, these types of activities are really helpful for relieving stress. And so that was another important piece of what's available in the community. Are recreational and extracurricular activities available to these youth where they're living? It's an important aspect of them being able to feel more at home and more connected. And finally, in terms of access to cultural community, almost all of the youth talked about the importance of finding peers, especially at school, who also spoke Spanish or had a similar migration experience background. In particular, one youth said that her foster parents didn't speak much Spanish, and it was a struggle for them to communicate. She was feeling overwhelmed about not knowing the language and feeling discouraged about whether she ever would really learn to speak English. So she says, so when I met people who could speak Spanish, I felt comfortable. I felt happy that there were other people with whom I could speak and knew about my culture in Guatemala, and we all understood each other better. And there are also other people in the program from other countries with whom I could connect. And this youth seems to be expressing that finding her own place in this community, a place where she's understood, where she can connect with others who are similar to her, enables her to envision a future where she can also succeed. So we'll move on to the next theme.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the educational system. Everyone that we interviewed, and both Jenny and Tara mentioned this briefly, everyone spoke to the crucial role that school plays in assisting or hindering a youth's integration. We know that children and youth spend a majority of their time in school, and this is a space in which they learn not just academics, but social skills and cultural norms. The survey that we conducted showed that most youth are enrolled in some sort of educational programming. All of foster care youth are enrolled in school. A majority of the family reunification youth were enrolled in school. However, a higher majority of the youth are enrolled in GED programs. For family reunification children, or children in the family reunification program, many of them start out attending mainstream classes and then will switch to a GED program. Youth face many barriers to school enrollment and are often steered towards GED programs for the youth in the family reunification program. We did hear of some youth being discouraged to enroll in school due to their age and or unlikelihood of graduating with same-aged peers. And we also learned of family unification youth who had difficulty enrolling in school because their sponsor was maybe not a biological parent. Of youth who are able to connect with supportive adults, the majority of them find them at school. Some of the themes that we found in regards to the educational system were supportive adults. Youth identified this as teachers who are passionate, a guidance counselor or a school social worker who is engaged, tutors and in-class interpreters. Having a supportive adult in the school setting made the transition easier, especially when the person spoke the youth's language and was willing to learn what the youth needed. Integrated programming in school looks like having a developed English as a second language or an ESL program, which allowed youth to also participate in mainstream classes. After-school supports are built in, and where youth find peers where they could speak to in a common language or who relate to their story, versus an isolated school system, which looks like a school that does not have an ESL program or is very new or very underdeveloped, and the youth do not fit into the school's program model. An isolated school setting also looks like a school without much diversity. There are no appropriate supports, either in class or after school. And we found that there was one program in the study that was in a district with very few other Spanish-speaking children or teachers were connected with the school. So it made it very difficult for that child in the school environment. Addressing mental health needs, as we may know, frustrations and mental health issues can impact school education and learning. Positive relationships with peers and adults normalize support for in-school counseling, and performance at school impacts mental health either positively or negatively. We also saw the need for appropriate assessments for non-literate children. There are many children that come from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador who have no history of formal education. We also need assessments for children with very limited formal education, youth with special needs, and assessments designed and adapted for Spanish speaking. So having assessments created for this specialized population is a need, and we'll elaborate further on that in the recommendation section. But next, we'll move into the legal system.
Thanks, Simi. In our research, youth caregivers and caseworkers reported repeatedly that the legal immigration status of an unaccompanied youth in the U.S. has a significant impact on their ability to integrate into communities. One of the most significant challenges a lack of legal status brings to youth is the stigma and the fear of deportation that could impede their daily lives. Simple activities like walking down the street to go to school can often leave them feeling a fear or a sense that they could be deported. Some of this is impacted by their ability to obtain a legal counsel or to obtain an attorney. Youth caregivers and caseworkers all noted that representation is a key component to success in the immigration courts. Data from Syracuse University's track concurred with these sentiments and found that whether or not an unaccompanied juvenile or an unaccompanied youth has an attorney was the single most important factor influencing the case's outcome in immigration courts. Nationally, around 3 out of 4 cases represented by an attorney result in a child being allowed to remain in the U.S. For those youth not represented, approximately 80% are ordered removed or voluntary departure. Caregivers, youth, and caseworkers in our study over and over again reported the difficulties in obtaining legal counsel and the feelings of relief it provided when they were able to find legal counsel and be represented by an attorney. One case manager commented on the impact of an unaccompanied youth not having legal counsel. If they don't have the money, it's hard for them. Even though they may qualify for a legal status, they may not get it because they don't have an attorney and they can't afford to get it. So that just sort of notes just the importance of being able to have an attorney and the impact it has on the youth's ability to integrate in the U.S. The other thing that came up in our interviews was the immigration legal process. So really the time spent in deportation proceedings and the time spent in the immigration court process. What we heard in all of our interviews was that the shorter it is, the quicker it is that the youth is able to integrate into their communities. Oftentimes this process can be very long, it can be very confusing, and it often produces anxiety for both the youth and the caregiver while they're going through it. Their future is sort of left in limbo. National data shows that the average wait in the immigration court is around 668 days. And in our study, we saw the same thing. Although some of our youth were a bit shorter than the national average. Unaccompanied youth in the foster care program waited on average of waited anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. And in the family reunification program, it was anywhere from 1 to 2 years. And oftentimes it was having an attorney that was able to speed those processes up. So the immigration process is something that can often be daunting for the youth and the family, and as soon as they are either out of that process and they have some sort of case outcome, or they have an attorney to help them through that, it was often commented in our interviews that that helped them be able to integrate into their communities better and more effectively. The other piece of the immigration process for youth is they're often impacted by their geographic location. And in our study, when we interviewed across the U.S. in various different regions and states in the U.S., we found a real discrepancy in the services that youth were able to obtain with or without an immigration status. So some states and cities, as we know, are more welcoming than others when it comes to youth and adults who are undocumented. For example, in New York City, youth have access to health insurance and ID cards despite their immigration status. Some cities have very welcoming school districts that accommodate English language learners and accommodate new immigrants. Other cities, however, have limited access to public benefits for youth who don't have a legal status, or other cities may not have schools that are as welcoming to the youth who don't speak English. And so there are many youth who, because of their geographic location, are impacted by their not having a legal status in the U.S. And that's something that we heard quite a bit from youth and from caregivers in the ways that they were able to integrate into societies. We've talked about earlier just how they interact with the educational system, and oftentimes their legal status can play a big role in that. So obviously that sort of leads us to the impact of their legal status and their ability to integrate into the U.S. And what we heard overwhelmingly is that a legal status and a decision that's been made while they're in the immigration courts is a huge factor in their ability to successfully integrate into the U.S. It's something that drops down walls, it drops down barriers, and suddenly the world around them can become more accessible. They may qualify for a child's health program in that state or other public services that could be beneficial to them while they make their lives in the U.S. It's also a relief from a constant fear of being deported, or it brings sort of a closure to this unknown of what the future holds for an unaccompanied youth. The other sort of piece of the legal status that impacted the youth's ability to integrate was the legal status of their parents, and this came up in some of our interviews, where sponsors can present barriers to youth being able to attend legal hearings because their fear of being deported themselves. And so this is another thing that played a key role in their ability to integrate. So typically sponsors or caregivers that had a legal status, youth found it easier to navigate with the court system because maybe their sponsors or their caregivers had done that previously. We can't overstate enough the impact of the legal process and the legal status that has on an unaccompanied child integrating into the U.S. And the impact that it has on their families overall. One case manager said regarding a youth, "It's definitely a sigh of relief. You may see a youth who was hunched over a little, and now they are standing up straight because they know I'm here and I'm legally here and I'm going to stay here."
So now we come to the theme of family and relational support. And it's probably not possible to overstate the importance of a strong bond in the home for these children, and the fact that all of these youth have been separated at some point from their parents or caregivers for any period of time only underscores their need for this type of support in order to be able to succeed in their new lives here. And I'm going to open this section with two quotes from different youth. The first youth says, "In my opinion, if there isn't any peace in the home, people, including me, think, I don't want to go home. I want to be somewhere else. And you're constantly thinking this all day, even while you're in school, and that's all you can think about." And by contrast, another youth shares, "I'll talk to my foster mom and I'll ask her, what do you think of this? And she'll say, I think that's a good idea, or I don't think that's a good way to look at it. Just knowing that there is someone supporting me, that I'm not alone in all of this, that there is one place in this world where my opinion matters, my voice matters, and that I mean something to someone, that helps me a lot." And I think these two quotes demonstrate the centrality of supportive relationships, especially in the home. And we believe that begins with careful preparation and education for the caregivers prior to placement of the child, whether it's a reunification of a parent and a child who have been separated for many years, or the placement of a child into a new foster home. The caregiver needs training and information on what to expect, on how to recognize and address trauma and conflict in the home with this child. So for families that may be reunifying, that training may focus on addressing the honeymoon period, so the time when a child initially comes into the home and things seem to be going smoothly and everyone is still on their best behavior, and then the transition that we expect a few months in when people start to really slide back into their normal ways of operating, and that we need to prepare families for that transition and what that will really look like after a period of settling in, or helping families to acknowledge a child's feelings of abandonment after a long period of separation, or how to establish rules and boundaries in the home, especially for parents who have missed a good gap of parenting this particular child, and now the child who was, a young school-age kid is coming to you and is a teenager, and there are different kinds of rules and boundaries that are needed in the home, and the parent may not have very much experience doing that. In foster family settings, the preparation may focus more on helping foster parents to understand their role, and especially in a transitional period in the life of the child, and dealing with past forms of relationships with authority figures, understanding the youth's context, where they're coming from, maybe what abilities and skills they have or abilities and skills they don't have, depending on where they're coming from. So some kids may be very street savvy. They know a lot about what it means to live on the street, but they don't know what it means to live in a home, and so they need a lot of help making those transitions and learning some of those basic skills. as a baseline, most of the programs that we work with are careful to cover trauma as part of their training for caregivers and the impact that trauma will have on the youth and their relationship to their caregiver. So seeing the signs of trauma, being more aware of the traumatic experiences that the majority of these youth have experienced, and how to respond in those moments. We know that healthy relationships are built one small step at a time through consistency over a long period of time, and that basic trust is built when youth understands that the adult is committed to him or her for the long haul. And many of our experienced caregivers express this, saying things like, not every placement has worked out, but I think the ones that did, I think they still consider themselves part of our family, even though they've moved on. So parents, foster parents who really treat children like family instead of a guest. Or another caregiver who said, my goal as a sponsor is to make sure that they are never lacking what they need. If they want to leave, they can, but if they want help, they will have it. And so it's that sense that these adults are committed to the children who are with them for as long as that relationship continues, and that they're consistent in their boundaries and the way that they relate to the child. In one particular interview with a youth who was reunified with her parents, there's a consistent answer to many of the questions that we asked her in this interview. What helped you to feel safe? Who helped meet your needs? How did you get enrolled in school? Who helped you to resolve problems? And to all of these questions, she consistently answers, my parents. They're like the steady drumbeat in the background of her adjustment to this new life. And her goal now is to graduate from school and to become a police officer. Her parents, she says, they say if I keep going on like this, I can do what I want to do. So they're an important aspect of being able to feel safe and welcomed, and to have a space to process traumatic experiences, and now to be able to integrate into the community where they're living. We also heard about the importance of support networks, and specifically the support networks of the caregiver, the adult that the child is going to, that oftentimes the support network that the adult has developed becomes the support network for their child who's coming to them. One of the directors of a family reunification program that we surveyed said, the largest indicator regarding which youth would have successful integration was the integration level of the sponsor, regardless of what type of relationship they had with the child. If the sponsor spoke English, was involved at church, was able to drive legally, etc., this made the youth much more likely to have a successful experience in the community. And we also know that family is of great importance to these youth, and not just the family that they're coming to, but oftentimes the family that they've left behind in their country of origin. That even from a distance, those relationships continue to be a critical part of their support network, and they need to be carefully maintained and facilitated. Those relationships need to be facilitated for the child so that they can have a sense of continuity in relationships from the time they leave to the time they arrive in the U.S. And then finally, of course, especially for children and teens, finding positive peer relationships is critical to this stage of their development. And as we said before, many youth shared the importance of finding a peer with whom they could relate at school or in the community. And we heard that again and again in the interviews, that helping these kids to connect with positive peer relationships is part of what will help them connect more in the community. And now we'll move to our last theme, which is related to the strengths of youth.
Thanks, Tara. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, and I'm sure you've already gathered in listening to some of the other themes, when speaking to case managers, reading their transcripts, and reading their survey answers, one common word was used continuously by them and by their sponsor and the caregiver to describe the youth that we serve, and that word is resilient. Considering the amount of stressors, abuse, and or trauma the youth are suffering or have experienced, it's astounding to see the level of resiliency they have and the drive they have to succeed in the United States. They're enrolled in school, they're giving back to their community, and what this small research study has found so far is that they are successfully integrating in our communities. In regards to the strengths that they possess, we found some of the following themes. So for coping skills, we saw youth having a very positive outlook, being very thankful for the opportunity to be in the U.S. And having the opportunities to go to school and to live in safe communities. Being able to talk about their experience and their history and what they've gone through. Being able to continue their contact with family members back in country of origin who are providing support to them, both emotionally and vice versa, youth that are providing support for their families back in country of origin. Some youth reported participating in exercise, art, or other forms of expression to release any sort of or dealing with the experiences that they've lived through, participating in sports or different sorts of hobbies. Goals, all of them mentioned, for those of them that were enrolled in school, to be able to finish their educational programming. Graduating from school when some of them thought that that wasn't even a possibility for them suddenly has become a very, very important goal, and they see that it's one that they can achieve if they put the work into it. For those youth that are able to work legally in the U.S., a lot of them reported being able to work in order to provide financially for their family and country of origin. A lot of them reported that that could have been a main reason for them coming to the U.S. as well. So the opportunity to work and to be able to give back to their family was very important to them. They also reported heightened senses of self-awareness. So knowing when to ask for help from either their caregiver or their sponsor or their case manager or a supportive adult in school. Having awareness of their own self-worth, knowing what they can and are entitled to receive while they're here. There was one youth who reported that he wasn't getting along with his foster parent, and he had come to a place where he was able to advocate for himself, and he told his case manager that things were just not working out, and the case manager was able to place him in another placement. They can also successfully talk about their own strengths. They reported as feeling persistent and having a drive to succeed. Excuse me. And a lot of them were able to name what their own coping skills were. So going back to the first point on coping skills, a lot of them can actually say that these are some of the skills that they've learned and are able to help them feel better or deal with the frustrations that they might have. Helping others, a lot of them reported a need for wanting to volunteer, to be able to give back to their community. Like I said, a lot of them feel very thankful for the opportunity to be in the U.S. and to be here safely and to have the opportunities that they have afforded to them. So they want the chance to give back and volunteer. Again, they want to be able to help their families in their country of origin. Some of them who are parents themselves are motivated to accomplish their own goals in order to make a better life for their child. A lot of them reported that because of their involvement in this program and the adults that they have been connected to, reported wanting to be a social worker or a nurse or a teacher. So giving back to the community and going into that helping profession to be able to help, they said, someone else in a position who needs help, like I needed help. And they also reported wanting to live in a place where everyone has an equal voice. A lot of them said that that was very important to them, and to not look down upon them because they're here without status or in the process of adjusting their status. But there are youth who are trying to escape a situation that I think any of us would want to try to escape from, and they're just, they just want some opportunities to be able to succeed if we're able to give those to them.
And this leads us to really the final piece of wrapping up this webinar and wrapping up our study and coming out with some recommendations. So from all of the interviews that we had with youth and caseworkers and with caregivers, and through the surveys that we did with each of the different agencies across the U.S., some common themes came out of that, and out of those came recommendations. Many of our recommendations involve expanding funding so that youth have access to the services that they need. So one of the first things noted is expanding funding so that all unaccompanied youth can have access to both medical and mental health services, no matter what state they live in, and no matter whether or not they're in the foster care program or in the family reunification program. We also would recommend that funding is expanded so that all unaccompanied youth can have access to legal services and also educational services, as these two things play a significant role in the youth's ability to integrate into the U.S. Another recommendation we have is to expand funding so that all unaccompanied youth can have access to case management services. This is something that's only available for unaccompanied youth that are in either the foster care program or the family reunification program. And many other youth that are living in cities across the U.S. Who may be unaccompanied don't necessarily have access to case managers to help them through their integration process. And something we feel is something that we saw from the study that's very important in impacting the youth's ability to integrate. And finally, we also recommend that additional research on evidence-based practices and models for case management are conducted, as well as research on caregiver preparation and support and agency service models, so that agencies, case managers can be better equipped to serve these youth from an empirical standpoint. We truly hope and would recommend that this research can be a springboard for further resource. As Simi mentioned earlier on in the presentation, we have one of the limitations of our study is that it's a small sample size. And we hope that future studies and future work like this can be done so that we can hear from more youth and more caregivers who are caring for and providing for unaccompanied youth, so that we can better shape programming and policies to best meet their needs as they integrate into the U.S.
Great, thank you guys so much. So we will now open it up to questions. Again, you can use the chat pod on the right here. I see some people have already been writing in. And if we don't get to your question, once again, we'll be sure to answer that in the comments section of the BRYCS blog.
So one question from Maribel is, how can organizations that provide foster care case management services be a resource for further research and evidence-based practices? Certainly, if you are part of an organization that has a relationship with Migration Refugee Services at USCCB, you can reach out to us to let us know about your interest. But more broadly, I think, Jackie, feel free to jump in here. The BRYCS online community is a great place to be able to share some of the promising practices or evidence-based practices that you might be using with this population. And Jackie, I don't know if you want to talk at all about how you can share those ideas through BRYCS.
Sure. Are you meaning programs or like resources?
Looks like this person works for a foster care program that would like to be able to participate further in sharing best practices.
Okay, so we have, if you're not familiar with the BRYCS website, we have a great promising practices database. I'll throw this link here in the chat box. So if you feel that your program would fit the qualifications of this database, you can certainly submit it for review. Right now we have over 120 some programs documented around the U.S., and we have started to document international programs as well. So we're always looking to add more to this database.
Thanks, Jackie. And there's another question on there from Maria regarding our research and whether or not these are all success stories. So though the youth that were highlighted in this research had various challenges when they came to the U.S. and in their integration process, many of them were successful in integrating into their communities. And I think because of the nature of the way our study was set up and the nature of the way that we submitted requests to be a part of this research project, many of the youth that were willing to participate had successful outcomes. So that sort of had something to do with our methodology. And for those youth who are deported and maybe do not have legal counsel, Maria is asking what happens to them. And I think, honestly, I think more research needs to be done in following the outcomes of those youth. Because, we hear anecdotal evidence of, some youth who get deported or some youth who are not able to obtain legal counsel, but we don't know with real or with raw data what we can say about those youth. And I think one of the things in regards to legal counsel, I think we do have some raw data that says that 80% of youth who do not have legal counsel are often deported or given a voluntary departure.
So Veronica and Sandra asked a two-part question. So would you be able to share the study with us if finalized? And has our research prompted us to do any advocacy with policymakers? So yes, we are able to share the results of the study once it is finalized. We're in the finalization process right now, and usually whenever we publish a study, we will post it onto the USCCB website. So you can keep checking there to see once it's finalized, and maybe it'll also be on the BRYCS website, and maybe as a reference to this presentation, we can just provide maybe like an update that the study has been done and has been published, and it's available for download or review on the USCCB website. And if it's prompted some advocacy with policymakers, that's our goal. So we do have a policy department within USCCB, and once the research has been finalized, if we do have some advocacy recommendations that could be taken into consideration by funding resources or our funding resource, or actually our funding agency, or even the government, then they will try to advocate for the population that we serve. Our mission is to advocate for vulnerable population, and this is definitely a population that falls under our mission. So we're continuously advocating for them on a regular basis, regardless of the current research project that we're doing. I think, Tara, there was a question about foster parents, if you wanted to answer that one. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, I see Steve asked the question, how can foster parents be more involved with legal counsel meetings if we are not allowed to attend these meetings? So, Steve, you're right that the meetings between foster youth and their attorneys are, because they're protected by confidentiality, that generally foster parents are probably not allowed to be in the meetings with the youth. But I think some of what we discussed in terms of the impact on the legal process for kids does have maybe more of a emotional, psychological impact on children, and certainly processing some of the anxiety that they are experiencing around their legal case would be helpful, and is a role that foster parents can certainly play. Also, being as educated as you can about the legal system, engaging, hopefully there's a case manager in the picture there with you, and even if you can't talk with the attorney about the specifics of the case, you can learn a little bit more about what the process involves, and then just being there to support the foster youth in your home through kind of the unknown of what's coming up in that legal case, and encouraging them sort of with their coping skills to process the anxiety and the unknown. I think even taking youth to their appointments, if you can't go in with them, knowing that you're sitting out there waiting for them in the lobby, that you're there for them, that you're going to be there to support them on the drive home if they have something to talk about. I think those are some ways that foster parents can be supportive in that. I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but Jenny, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think really showing your support and being able to be a sounding board and emotionally helping the youth process their legal process and their legal meetings. And then also, just to reiterate what Tiara said, supporting them in the sense of bringing them to their meetings and prioritizing their meetings with attorneys to show that this is important and to show that the foster parent is there with the youth.
So Maria asked a question, is there a quota for the U.S. government to accept unaccompanied children and youth? And there is not a numerical quota in terms of acceptance of unaccompanied children. There are laws that govern which children need to be evaluated and come into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is the program that we're talking about in terms of this study. So children who are from non-contiguous countries to the United States, so excluding Canada and Mexico, any child who comes to the U.S. border who's undocumented has a right to express their fear about returning to their country of origin, and then is taken into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where their case is evaluated, and the vast majority of those children are reunified with a sponsor here in the United States. So when we were referring to the Family Reunification Program, that's what we were talking about. And then a much smaller percentage of those youth actually have no appropriate adult to go to in the U.S., and that's when they would be referred for a long-term foster care program, and that's the foster care program that we were referring to.
Great. Thank you, ladies, so much. So with that, I will close up today's presentation. If you had additional questions, please do visit our blog, and you can submit your question in the comment section of the blog area. So with that, we will leave you with our contact information, our website, www.brycs.org, our email, our toll-free number, and if you are on social media, please do give us a follow on Facebook or on Twitter, and we will you'll be able to keep abreast of the newest resources from BRYCS, as well as new webinars and presentations like this one today. So thank you everybody for joining us, and when I close today's presentation, you'll be redirected to a short evaluation, and we do appreciate your feedback. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie.